This is the first video in a little series of 2 videos where I talk about post-processing mistakes and how to avoid them. Before I start, I quickly want to point out my homepage where I have some more in-depth tutorials, so if you're interested in my complete workflow or some special techniques which go a little beyond to what I show here on YouTube, feel free to check those out. It's certainly a good idea to try to get as much as possible right with just one exposure, by for example using graduated neutral density filters to even out the exposure, or by calculating the hyperfocal distance to set the focus appropriately. But when shooting digital, you shouldn't rely solely on this one exposure, especially if you've traveled far to a place to capture it. So what I usually do, besides using filters and setting the focus as good as possible, I also add bracketed exposures. So for example here I just take several exposures, and I also change the focus. I use the hand to shield the sun to avoid lens flares. All in all, I take a lot of photos to make sure that from such a travel I bring home enough material to create a perfect result, and not to rely on only one exposure where I then recognize at home that the focus might have been a little bit off and I got the foreground a little soft or the background is a little soft. So just creating some redundancy. And later I can just delete the photos I don't need for the processing. Another example where it's beneficial to not try to rely on just one exposure is when shooting seascapes, where you, for example, in this image have very dynamic wave patterns. You have a backflow of water here and some nice waves in the middle ground, and then the beautifully lit background. But this was not shot all in one exposure. I took many photos that evening, starting with focus stacking here, and then this is the shot which is basically used for the foreground. And then I have another shot where I have this nice wave here in the background. And I just blended those together to get an overall, for me, more pleasing result. And that's one thing. So it's always good to try to get as close as possible to the final image with one exposure, but then always taking a few additional shots, especially at the sea where you have so much changes. I usually take like 20, 30 or 40 photos of one scene, and in the end I select the ones I'll use in the post-processing and delete the rest. And this is quite easy when shooting digital. During raw processing, one mistake I often made in the past was to apply too much pre-sharpening in the beginning. So let's look at this image, which is an image from 2011, or no, 2010 I think even, which was shot at Walchensee in Germany. And if we look closely, we see that here at the edges of the mountains there are some fringes, which you could see if we go to 400 or 300%. Here's some sharpening artifacts happening, so a white border around this. And those fringes usually happen if you apply too much pre-sharpening in the beginning, then continue with your normal post-processing where contrasts are added, for example. And this post-processing further increases those sharpening artifacts which were added in the beginning. And so this is why currently, or the last years, I do all my sharpening at the end of my workflow, even the pre-sharpening, so I reduce the sharpening in the beginning to a minimum, and not like with this image here where I had set it to 77%, which is giving me already a quite sharp representation here, but also introduces some of those fringes. And as I told you, this is further increased during post. What I could now do to still clean up this image a bit, I could just use layer, set it to darken mode, and this usually works quite well if you have such easy edges along the mountains. Then I take the stamp tool and I just start at one part of the image. I sample an area a little above the fringe and I paint over it. And having this layer at darken, maybe at 80% is enough, this will only remove the fringe and not affect the mountains, which are darker than the sky. So this is a way I can now still salvage this image and clean it up a bit, but it's also a lot of work, as you see, so it's better to void it in the beginning, and this is usually to apply. If you now I remove it, I go to like 5% or less and just do the sharpening in the end, which I also describe in my complete workflow tutorials. One post-processing mistake that should be avoided at all costs is to forget to remove chromatic aberrations. So a quick look at this image, if we go to 200%, shows that here in the outer parts of the image, so more to the edges, I got quite a few chromatic aberrations, and mind that this is a 200% view, which is why we see them that pronounced here. And this was shot with a Canon 1635 f4 lens, which normally is quite good in coping with those aberrations, but yeah, you still get some of them. And if I would now forget to remove it in raw processing, I'll pull them over into Photoshop, and there it would be much harder to remove it. So the most important step during raw processing really is to activate the chromatic aberration removal. And you see this does the magic. The chromatic aberrations are gone. And this is usually one of the first steps I'll do. And you could also create a basic setting which you apply to all images during import, which I don't do because this would apply to all my images and this would increase the time of the import. But anyways, this setting, removal of chromatic aberrations, should be always checked. During raw processing, there's already the possibility to add clarity to an image, and also during further post-processing, there are many ways to add to micro contrast to increase it. A common mistake I found I did in the past was to do those micro contrast enhancements too early in the post-processing. For example, by increasing the clarity in RAW or by adding micro contrast in the beginning, and also when doing this, adding it globally. For example, this image of the Grand Canyon, it's very contrasty. It has a lot of micro contrasts. The problem I see here, it's globally. So what contrasts an image do, they usually draw the eye. So if you have contrasty edges, the eye goes, or the viewer looks there. And you can use micro contrast in an image to highlight areas and to draw the eye to certain areas in an image. And if applied globally and too early in the post-processing, you kind of lose this tool later on. So for example, this image here, which I processed I think 2 years later than the other one, I didn't add so much micro contrast in the beginning, and I ended up with this much softer image now in the end. And this, all in all, might be a little too soft, but what I can now do with this image, I can apply micro contrast to certain parts of the image to draw the viewer in. For example, adding some micro contrast just here in the middle part of the image and leaving the outer parts a little more diffuse, and by this keeping the viewer in the image. And adding this micro contrast further to the end, I have much more control. And for example, I can use the NIC tools output sharpener for it. So in the output sharpener, if I reduce the strength of the output sharpening, I have some further sliders, which are, for example, structure and local contrast. And those two sliders basically work on the micro contrasts in the image. I can use those to increase it, and then using a mask to selectively apply it. So this is currently my preferred way of adding micro contrasts to the image, doing it further to the end of the processing during the multipass sharpening. Also adding those micro contrasts in the end, it's easier to avoid too much noise in the image, because increasing those contrasts also increases noise a bit, and if I do this selectively in the end, I have much more control. Another mistake that should be avoided during post-processing is to start with an image that's too dark. So the first thing to get right is the exposure in camera, using concepts like exposed to the right, where I have another video about it, and then in RAW to prepare the image for Photoshop in a way that it's not darker than the result you're after. So, for example, with this image, the photo I took over from RAW to Photoshop is still a bit brighter than the final result. So the first thing, I did the processing to move the photo in the direction of the final result, but keeping it brighter. And then in Photoshop, I could work on the mood, further darkening the image and getting a high quality result in the end. Instead of starting with a dark image and then trying to brighten areas which are already too dark and introducing additional noise by it. Here's an image from La Paz, which also very good shows the concept of exposing to the right. So this is the final image where the histogram is far to the left, and this is quite a good representation of this night scene. The starting image, or the raw image which I took over to Photoshop, is still a bit brighter. So here the histogram is more to the middle, and in Photoshop I went on and further darkened it. But the ultimate raw, from which I started the processing, was this one, which is far exposed to the right. So if we look at this, the concept is quite clear. So I have no blown highlights in the image, or just a few lights down here in the city, which is not too bad. And I have a lot of space on the left here, thus resulting in a very bright image. And although this doesn't look at all as the scene in front of my eyes that evening, it's a good starting material, especially if you're shooting with Canon. And let's go back. And if we then process this, or do the raw processing, moving it a bit closer to the final result, and then moving to Photoshop and doing the final processing, we end up with a very high quality result without much noise in the image.